The Sands Hotel, Las Vegas, November 11th, 1972, Veterans Day. Dean Martin was halfway through Everybody Loves Somebody when he saw the wheelchair, third row, center. A young man, couldn't have been older than 25, sitting motionless while everyone around him stood and swayed to the music. His legs were covered with a blanket, his hands gripped the armrests of his chair, and his eyes were locked on Dean, with an intensity that cut through the spotlight glare. Dean kept singing, but something had shifted. The audience didn't notice. They never noticed when Dean's mind went somewhere else. That was his gift, the ability to perform on autopilot while the real Dean Martin was miles away, thinking thoughts he'd never share with anyone. The song ended. The applause washed over him like warm water. Dean raised his glass to the crowd, made a joke about needing a refill, and the band launched into the next number. But Dean wasn't listening to the music anymore. He was looking at that wheelchair, and he was thinking about a war he'd never fought. To understand what happened next, you need to understand something about Dean Martin that almost nobody knew. Something he buried so deep that even his closest friends rarely glimpsed it. Dean Martin was ashamed, not of his success, not of his fame, not of any of the usual things that haunted celebrities in the small hours of the night. He was ashamed because he'd never served. World War II, the greatest conflict in human history. 16 million Americans put on uniforms and shipped overseas to fight fascism. Dean's friends went, his neighbors went, boys he'd grown up with in Steubenville came home in flag-draped coffins. Dean stayed home. He was classified 4F, unfit for military service. A double hernia, they said, the same condition that had bothered him since his boxing days. The army doctors examined him, shook their heads, and sent him back to civilian life. Dean never talked about it. When people assumed he'd served, and they often did, because what Italian-American man of his generation hadn't? Dean would change the subject. A joke, a drink, a story about something else entirely. But the shame lived inside him like a stone in his chest. He'd watch war movies and feel like a fraud. He'd meet veterans and struggle to look them in the eye. He'd hear stories of sacrifice and heroism and think, while they were dying on beaches, I was singing in nightclubs. Frank Sinatra understood. Frank had been 4F too, a punctured eardrum. The two of them never discussed it directly. That wasn't how men of their generation communicated, but there was an unspoken recognition between them, a shared weight. The difference was that Frank seemed to have made peace with it. Dean never did. A makeup artist who worked Dean's television show for 8 years remembered a moment in 1968. The news was on in the dressing room. Vietnam. Footage of soldiers in the jungle. Young men, barely out of high school, carrying rifles and dodging bullets. Dean watched in silence. Then he said, very quietly, almost to himself, "Those kids. Those goddamn brave kids." He didn't speak again until the cameras rolled. The makeup artist said she'd never seen Dean look so old. November 11th, 1972, Veterans Day. The Sands had advertised it as a special show. Dean Martin salutes America's heroes. The audience was filled with veterans. World War II, Korea, and now Vietnam. Men in their 70s sitting next to boys barely old enough to drink. 3 generations of warriors gathered to hear the King of Cool sing love songs. Dean hadn't wanted to do the show. His manager, Mort Viner, had convinced him. Good publicity, good for the brand, good for America. Dean had agreed, but reluctantly. He felt like a fraud accepting applause from men who had actually sacrificed something. The young man in the wheelchair was named Michael Reeves, 23 years old. He'd been a sergeant in the Army, 101st Airborne Division, stationed near Da Nang. 8 months earlier, a landmine had taken both his legs below the knee. His parents had brought him to the show as a birthday present. Michael hadn't wanted to come. Since returning from Vietnam, he'd avoided crowds, avoided noise, avoided anything that reminded him of who he used to be. The man who could run 5 miles without breaking a sweat. The man who jumped out of helicopters into enemy territory. The man who had legs, but his mother had begged. "Dean Martin," she'd said. "Your father and I danced to his music on our wedding night. Please, Michael, just this once." So Michael sat in his wheelchair in the third row of the Sands Hotel, watching Dean Martin perform, feeling like a ghost haunting his own life. He didn't expect Dean to notice him. Why would he? There were 2,000 people in that room. Michael was just another face in the crowd, another broken soldier trying to remember what joy felt like. But Dean had noticed. Halfway through the show, Dean stopped the music. This wasn't unusual. Dean often stopped mid-performance to riff with the audience, to tell a joke, to pour himself another drink. The crowd loved it. They came to see Dean Martin be Dean Martin, and nothing was more Dean Martin than ignoring the script. But this time was different. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dean said, his voice lower than usual, "I want to do something a little different tonight." The audience murmured. "I see we've got a lot of veterans in the house, and I want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Thank you for everything you've done, everything you've sacrificed." Applause erupted. Dean waited for it to fade. "There's a young man sitting right down here in the front, third row." A spotlight swung toward Michael Reeves. Michael froze. Every eye in the room turned to look at him. His face flushed red. His hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair so hard his knuckles went white. "Son, I don't know your name, but I know what you did for this country, and I want you up here on this stage with me." The audience roared. Michael shook his head. "No, no way, not like this." But Dean was already walking toward him. Dean Martin stepped off the stage. He walked down the steps, past the orchestra pit, past the front row of tables. He walked until he was standing directly in front of Michael Reeves, close enough to touch him. The room fell silent. "What's your name, son?" Michael could barely speak. "Michael. Michael Reeves. Michael." Dean smiled. Not the stage smile. Something realer. "I'm Dean, and I'd be honored if you'd sing a song with me." "I can't. I don't." "Sure you can. Everybody can sing. Even if you're terrible, we'll make it sound good. That's what the band's for." A few people laughed, nervously. Dean leaned down, close to Michael's ear. What he said next, only Michael heard. "I never served, kid. I wanted to. They wouldn't let me, so let me do this. Let me honor you, please." Michael looked into Dean Martin's eyes, and he saw something he hadn't expected. Pain. Real pain. The kind that lives in a man for decades, hidden beneath jokes and smiles and the easy armor of charm. Michael nodded. Dean straightened up and turned to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, Sergeant Michael Reeves of the 101st Airborne is going to join me for a song. Let's give him a hand getting up here." 2 stage hands appeared. They lifted Michael's wheelchair up the side stairs onto the stage. The audience stood and applauded, a thunderous sound that shook the room. Michael sat in his wheelchair at center stage, next to Dean Martin. Under lights bright enough to blind, he was terrified. Dean put a hand on his shoulder. "We're going to do America the Beautiful. You know the words?" "I think so." "Good. Just follow me." "And Michael?" "Yeah? Thank you. For what you did over there. Thank you." The band began to play. Dean Martin sang the opening verse, his voice low and warm, filling the room with a tenderness that made people forget he was supposed to be the king of cool. "Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain." Then he stopped. He looked at Michael. He nodded. Michael Reeves opened his mouth. His voice cracked on the first note. It was thin, uncertain, nothing like Dean's polished baritone. But he kept going. "For purple mountain majesties, above the fruited plain." And then something happened. The audience started singing too. One voice, then 10, then 100, 2,000 people, veterans and civilians, young and old, all of them joining in. The sound swelled until it filled every corner of the Sands Hotel, until it seemed to lift the roof off the building. "America, America, God shed his grace on thee." Dean Martin was crying. He didn't try to hide it. He stood there next to Michael Reeves, tears streaming down his face, singing along with everyone else. "And crown thy good with brotherhood, from sea to shining sea." The song ended. Silence. Then the room exploded. The standing ovation lasted 4 minutes. People were weeping openly. Strangers were hugging each other. The energy in that room was something beyond entertainment, beyond performance. It was communion. It was healing. Dean helped Michael back to his wheelchair. He knelt down so they were eye to eye. "You did good, soldier." Michael was crying too. "Why did you do this? Why me?" Dean was quiet for a moment. Because I spent my whole life singing songs while men like you were fighting wars. Because I never got to serve. And it's the one regret I'll take to my grave. Because you're the hero, Michael. Not me. You're the one who sacrificed. I just wanted, just once, to stand next to someone who actually earned the applause. Michael grabbed Dean's hand. Mr. Martin, you didn't need to serve. You've been making people happy for 30 years. That's a kind of service too. Dean smiled, but it was a sad smile. Maybe, but it's not the same. No, Michael agreed. It's not, but it still matters. Dean looked at the young man in the wheelchair. The young man who had lost his legs in a jungle on the other side of the world. The young man who had every reason to be bitter, to be angry, to rage against a universe that had taken so much from him. And instead, he was comforting Dean Martin. You're a hell of a man, Michael Reeves. So are you, Mr. Martin. Dean stood up. He walked back to center stage. He picked up the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, Sergeant Michael Reeves. The applause erupted again. Michael waved, embarrassed and overwhelmed, and feeling, for the first time in months, like maybe he still mattered. That night, after the show, Dean found Michael and his parents in the lobby. He invited them to dinner. They sat in a private room at the Sands until 2 in the morning. Dean didn't drink much, unusual for a man who had built his image on the martini glass. He just listened. He asked questions. He wanted to know everything about Michael's service, his injury, his recovery. Michael's mother cried through most of the dinner. She kept saying, I can't believe Dean Martin is sitting here with us. Dean waved it off. I'm just a guy who sings, Mrs. Reeves. Your son's the special one. Before they left, Dean pulled Michael aside. What are you going to do now, after all this? Michael shrugged. I don't know. I was studying engineering before I enlisted. Maybe I'll go back to school. You should. You're smart. I can tell. Mr. Martin. Dean. Dean. Why did you really bring me up on stage tonight? The real reason. Dean looked at him for a long time. Because I needed to, Michael. Because somewhere inside me, there's a 20-year-old kid who wanted to serve his country and couldn't. And that kid has been waiting 30 years to stand next to a real hero and say thank you. He paused. You gave me that tonight, so thank you. Michael didn't know what to say. Dean shook his hand, hugged his parents, and disappeared into the Las Vegas night. They never saw him again. But Michael Reeves never forgot. He went back to school, earned his engineering degree, and spent the next 40 years designing accessible buildings, ramps, elevators, doorways wide enough for wheelchairs. He made the world easier for people like him, people who had sacrificed parts of themselves and needed the world to make room. In 2015, at the age of 66, Michael Reeves gave an interview to a documentary crew making a film about Vietnam veterans. They asked him about the hardest moment of his recovery. He talked about the months after he came home, the despair, the feeling that his life was over. And then he talked about that night at the Sands Hotel. Dean Martin saw me, Michael said, his voice wavering. He looked past all the fame and the spotlight and saw a broken kid in a wheelchair. And he didn't pity me. He honored me. He brought me up on that stage and treated me like I mattered. The interviewer asked if he'd ever tried to contact Dean after that night. Michael shook his head. I wrote him a letter once. After I graduated, I wanted to thank him. I don't know if he ever got it. He paused, but I like to think he knew. I like to think he knew that what he did that night, it saved my life. Not literally, but in every way that counts. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. Among his possessions, his family found a box of letters, hundreds of them. Letters from fans, from friends, from people whose lives he had touched in ways he never talked about. One of those letters was from Michael Reeves. It was dated May 1977. Dear Dean, it read, You don't remember me, but I remember you. 5 years ago, on Veterans Day, you pulled me out of the audience and onto the stage. I was in a wheelchair. I'd lost my legs in Vietnam. I wanted to disappear. You wouldn't let me. You made me sing. You made me feel like I still mattered. I graduated from college last week. I'm going to be an engineer. I'm going to design buildings that people like me can use. And every time I draw a ramp or widen a doorway, I'm going to think of you, of that night, of the way you looked at me and saw something worth honoring. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed you to know You saved me. Not from the fire, not from the enemy, from myself, and I'll be grateful for the rest of my life. Thank you, Dean, for seeing me, for honoring me, for reminding me that I still had something to give. With eternal gratitude, Michael Reeves. Dean had kept the letter for 18 years. It was found in the same box as photographs of his children, letters from Frank, and a few other things he couldn't bear to throw away. The things that mattered most. Dean Martin spent his entire career pretending not to care. That was his brand. The easy charm, the lazy smile, the man who made everything look effortless. But that night in 1972, he showed who he really was. A man who carried a secret shame for 30 years. A man who felt like a fraud accepting applause from people who had actually sacrificed. A man who finally found a way to honor the heroes he'd never gotten to be. He didn't save Michael Reeves from a burning building. He didn't carry him through enemy fire. He did something smaller. And in some ways, something bigger. He saw him. He honored him. He pulled him into the spotlight and said, "This is the hero, not me, him." That's the Dean Martin story they don't tell. Not the singer, not the comedian, not the king of cool, the man who spent his life carrying a weight he never talked about, and the night he finally found a way to set it down. If this story about honoring the heroes among us moved you, subscribe and hit that thumbs up. Share with someone who served, someone who sacrificed, someone who deserves to be seen. Have you ever had someone honor you when you felt invisible? Let us know in the comments. Ring that notification bell for more untold stories about Dean Martin's legacy.